Jacob is on his way. Welcome, Mr. Lindsay.
Good to be here. Hello, everyone. It looks like we are live on YouTube. A minute to go, and I see 12 participants. So I'll look to you guys in terms of timing, in terms of when you want to go ahead and start this meeting.
You've got 28 total.
Okay, got it. I mean, you must see something that I don't. Okay, well, we'll give folks a couple more minutes, and just let me know when you all want to start.
$32.
Just had a couple folks who were trying to get on who are texting me that weren't able to, so just gonna help them out. We can start.
We're up to 35 now.
Welcome, everyone. We'll be getting started in just a minute. Okay, Jacob, I think we have a full room, so whenever you want to get started.
Phenomenal. Thank you, Chloe. We will go ahead and get started. It is 6:02 p.m. So welcome, everyone. Thank you for being in attendance this evening. This is the second for the day meeting of the City of Charleston City Plan Water Lab. And this is an informational session where you are going to hear from city staff, but primarily the team of experts who we have hired to assist us to analyze how water is going to is currently and will affect the city of Charleston as we work on our comprehensive plan. That is what this session is about. So we'll go to our next slide. My name is Jacob Lindsay. I am the director of the planning department, and I'm just going to give a very brief introduction, and then I'll turn it over to our team to get right into this presentation. So first of all, just as we do before every meeting, a virtual gathering code of conduct. First of all, please be patient with each other and with the technology. Even though we're seasoned professionals, things do go wrong occasionally. Everyone's microphones will be muted for the duration of the event, and that's so that we can hear the speakers. And if you have questions, which we hope that you do, please use the chat box at the bottom of your Zoom program to ask those questions. We will look at those, and then we will have our team members answer those questions by the themes during the Q&A session. And I would also just remind everyone, this is being broadcast live on YouTube, and I believe that we're being recorded. I'm looking to my staff to verify that. I think that we are. Yes, we are, as of right now. Thank you, Chloe. Okay, very good. So we'll go to our next slide. Excellent. So just very briefly, this is our agenda. Welcome and introductions. That's what we're in right now. We're going to get into water and land use in the city plan, talk about what that means. Our team members will go through the preliminary analysis that they are currently working on. We'll have a Q&A, and then we'll talk, say thanks to folks, and then talk about our next steps. So that is today's meeting. We'll go to our next slide. So what is the Charleston City Plan? This plan is required by the state of South Carolina. Every major city has to produce a comprehensive plan. That plan guides the physical growth of the city. It is a vision plan that discusses the ways that the city will change over time. And it's developed by the Planning Commission, and it is adopted by our elected city council. And it is also revised every 10 years, and this is one of those years. This plan, of course, is done with key input from the community. It is not something that's created in a box, and that is why we are here among our many, many other engagement plans. So we'll go to our next slide. Now, what does a comprehensive plan do? First of all, it makes recommendations about the future, and this plan uses objective information and analysis to help make those recommendations. That's one of the things that you'll be seeing this evening. It also incorporates input from everyone. It's our job to listen to all people in the city, not just those who are the regulars at public meetings, but also folks who don't normally participate. We're really trying to listen to everyone. The plan also informs daily decisions by the City of Charleston's planning staff, by the Planning Commission, and by City Council when we look at changes in land use. So it's a document that we use every single day. There's a few things the plan doesn't do. It does not, by itself, change zoning in the City of Charleston. It makes recommendations, but any change in zoning has to be considered individually and has to be taken up by our Planning Commission and City Council. It does not change stormwater regulations. It is not about how individual sites are regulated at the technical level. That's handled by a completely different mechanism, and the handling of stormwater on individual development sites is a separate process that is run by our amazing stormwater department. The plan does not change taxation in the city. Nothing about your taxes will change as a result of this plan. It is about land use and growth and infrastructure, but it does not change anything related to taxes. And the last thing is that it doesn't make detailed policy recommendations that are already covered in other adopted plans. There are a whole constellation of other documents and plans that guide detailed policy. This is about the 30,000-foot guiding vision for our city. So we'll go to the next slide. Thank you, Andy. Just continuing on here, very briefly, an introduction. This plan, the Charleston City Plan in the year 2020, is rooted in 4 basic guiding principles. Water comes first. We're looking at where it is and where it's going to be. That's what we'll be talking about this evening. The second thing is that it's data smart, and we have used some of the best people in the country, and we are working with some phenomenal teams to gather the best data available and to understand the challenges facing the city objectively. We also acknowledge that there is strength in diversity, and that this plan is oriented toward actions that protect the city's historic diversity. And the last thing is that this is a plan that is empowered by the community. We are asking all members of the community to partner in the planning process, not just to give their input, but to help guide decisions that are made by staff as this plan is being created. We'll go to our next slide. I'm going to be done soon, I promise you. The city plan, as are all comprehensive plans, guided by 10 key elements. These are set forth by the state of South Carolina. It looks at population, economic development, natural resources, cultural resources, community facilities. These are things like public services, housing, of course, land use, transportation, something called priority investment. The comprehensive plan should inform the city's decisions about how to invest money in infrastructure. And then the last thing, which we are willingly adopting, is resilience, which is how we as a city bounce back from disasters and how we become more prepared for what the future will bring us. These are the 10 key elements that we have to address. So we'll go to the next slide. Okay, almost at the end here. If you look at this pinwheel diagram, starting at the very top, the first phase, which is what we're in now, is this phase in the kind of orange color, which is about defining existing conditions and establishing the shared vision. And tonight, we're going to be talking about the water and land use analysis, defining those existing and future conditions. This is not the plan. We're not at the point where we know what the city's going to do. We are hearing from experts who are looking at conditions on the ground so that we can make informed decisions. That's the phase that we're in right now, and that's what you'll be hearing this evening. Go to the next slide. Planning for water is our reality. And today we're going to do a deep dive into the preliminary analysis. Starting number one with water and land use. We're going to look at why does it flood? Where? What kind of flooding? How much? And how will this change with the climate? This is a key question for us to answer. How can our land be used to increase resiliency in different scenarios? We are beginning here because this is the reality of our city at sea level. That will then move into plan recommendations, and then later the plan implementation itself, where we will adopt policies and invest in programs that implement the recommendations in partnership with multiple departments, stakeholders in the community. This is how good government should work, making informed decisions that ultimately lead to changes that make the city better in the future. So we'll go to our next slide, and I'm going to wrap here very shortly. We are working with our team from the Dutch Dialogues. For those of you who are familiar with that, we had some of the foremost experts in the world look at how water interacts with our city in 4 areas. And now we are using that same team along with our dedicated city staff to look at the whole city. This is a citywide analysis, and it is a massive undertaking, as you will see. So we'll go to our next slide. And this is the last thing that I'll say, and then I'll turn it over to our team, because that's who you really want to hear from. So we're in this analysis phase, and the question in everybody's mind will be, what are we going to do? We are a city that is surrounded by water, and we have to confront our future with water. What are we going to do? And we know that there will be 4 strategies. There are areas of the city that will need to be defended from water. We will have to build defense systems, barricades that protect us from water. There are places in the city where we can adapt to water, where buildings and infrastructure can be elevated and it can be flooded. This is not unlike Folly Beach or any beach community today. They are adapted to higher seas. There are areas that we will need to reserve for sea level rise, where there should be no new construction because those places should be reserved to help us live with water. And then finally, there are places that are free of threat from rising sea levels. And those are areas where we should grow. So this strategy has not been figured out totally, but we know that this is where we are going. We're going to have to view the city through this lens in the future as we look at how water will change our future. So with that, we'll go to the next slide. And I am going to now turn this over. Thank you all for hearing me out in this brief introduction. At this point, I'm going to turn it over to our incredible team at Wagner & Ball, the Water Institute, Robinson Design Engineers, and Circulus, who will introduce themselves as they go. And thank you, everyone. And now I will turn it over to David and Andy.
Thank you, Jacob. Thank you, all Charlestonians who are listening in this evening. This is basic information. You know, it's not irrefutable, but it's pretty accurate. We have a good team. We have our partners in Charleston, Robinson Design Engineers, and Circulus have added a lot to our research and effort. We led the Dutch Dialogues process. This is something we started a decade plus ago in New Orleans, and it seems to be a good methodology. The basis of it is looking first at ground and water. those of us who own buildings or live in buildings or understand the top level. We think a lot about our houses. We think a lot about our buildings. We think about the properties we have. And then we move down and think about the infrastructure investments, the streets, the drainage systems, all those things. But it's all based in this ground and water. It's not as simple as looking only at elevation. You know, the transient state of water, the upland coastal condition, all those interfaces, we're going to try to explain to you a bit the methodology, the analysis has been going on. I'm going to introduce Andy Sternad, who's leading this effort at Wagner and Ball. And, you know, it can be a bit complicated. I don't know if any of you are back for another round of this, but the information is sound. And we're at the point now of, I think, being able to show you this, and maybe we can, as we go forward, interpret it a bit more. Andy, would you like to try to explain this library?
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining today. My name is Andy Sternad. I'm an architect and urban designer at Wagner and Ball here in New Orleans. I'm part of the Dutch Dialogues team. Just to give you a brief run of show for this evening, I'll be doing most of the talking, but we'll ask for some key support at key moments from members of our team, Aaron Stevens at Circulus, local landscape architecture firm, and Joshua Robinson Design Engineers, also there locally in Charleston. And then we'll wrap it up at the end. Dale Morris at the Water Institute of the Gulf is watching the chat window closely and taking notes. So please, as we go, if you have any questions, put those in the chat and Dale will collect those and we'll pose them all at the end. And finally, this is the purpose of tonight is a technical presentation of our analytical method. This is an in-progress look at our work so far. So this presentation is not meant to fully explain all of the landscape concepts and all of the functions out there in the landscape for a public audience. This is a very technical, it's going to be kind of like drinking from a fire hose. So I would encourage you to download this presentation, which will be available online later, and to study further. The slides probably are not going to stay on the screen as long as you'd like, or as long as you need to fully understand what we're saying, but I'll try my best. So who we talked to, we've been engaged in this project with the city over the course of the summer, even since early in the spring, and have tried to broaden our knowledge gained from Dutch Dialogues to all the areas across the city, like Jacob mentioned. So we've not been engaged in full public engagement. There's others in the city working on that effort, but we have talked to key elected officials, city staff, business and citizen leaders to try to get core analytical feedback that we need. This process isn't finished, it's still ongoing, and we've got a little while left this year to wrap this project up. So I would encourage your feedback, if you have any, to please reach out through the city. So I'll work through a couple of contextual issues around water, the types of water we're looking at that Jacob alluded to, and then how we're looking at those water and land types across different scales in the city. And then wrap up with a little bit of what it means, although we don't have any recommendations drafted at this point. So first of all, rain, something everyone's familiar with. As defined by the NOAA Atlas 14 metrics, this is a national data set. You'll just take note that the 2-year and the 25-year rainfall events are regulatory design storms in the state of South Carolina. So those are important events. However, they're smaller than the types of rainfall that we might be accustomed to seeing causing significant flood impacts. Those are more on the order of magnitude of 100-year or 500-year storms. That's a statistical percentage meant to indicate the chance of occurring in any given year. 100-year rainfall is a 1% chance in any given year with that amount of rain falling. What we've seen working across the country is that in many places, what is currently understood as the 100-year storm, what is currently understood as the 500-year storm, excuse me, is becoming the 100-year storm. That is to say that rainfall events of very high intensity are happening more often. And I think that's something that the city is already looking at incorporating in the stormwater guidelines, anticipating a 10% increase in rainfall. But we'll always need to look ahead at these future scenarios and identify a range of future potential. Another type of water context, the tide, of course, and sea level rise. The city has set a planning target 50 years out through its sea level rise strategy, all the way up to 2070, following the NOAA intermediate sea level rise projection. These projections are also something that are subject to change over time as science and data are revised and renewed. But the city is currently planning towards this 50-year benchmark of a 2 to 3 foot rise. That means for our comp plan purposes, looking at a 10-year look ahead, we're looking at somewhere just shy of 1 foot in sea level rise. But we have to be aware that the decisions we make today for land use and construction will often outlive that 10-year framework. So we're looking ahead towards 30-year length of a mortgage, for example, towards this 50-year target that the city set. Another water issue, storm surge. You'll see mapped in yellow here, the storm surge risk. This is mapped also by a particular type of model called the NOAA slosh model. This is a representation in yellow of the Category 3 storm surge. And this is a worst case scenario, Category 3 storm surge. Different types of storm models are used for different purposes, but for this representation, we're using kind of a worst case event at Category 3. And just for a point of comparison, Hugo in 1989 was a Category 4 storm at landfall just north of Charleston with a 12.9 foot storm tide at the battery. And that did not occur at high tide. So this is also an abstraction. It's, like I said, it's the worst case at every possible point. So no storm would cause this widespread of impact, which is again why we need to be looking at scenarios and ranges. I should say the storm surge is a really dramatic and striking impact across the city. However, it happens less frequently. So we also need to take that into account. Tidal and rainfall flood events will happen more often. And that's where we need to think about what the flood event actually means in our minds. It can mean different things in different places across town and can have different impacts in different places, the same event. So whether we're talking about keeping your feet dry or allowing emergency responders to reach all aspects of the city, all areas of the city, we can plan to different water thresholds, different types of events. Some types of structures are more adaptive than others. We'll get into this in a little more detail later, but a slab on grade structure is basically at risk starting at the point of its door threshold, the point where water might come inside. Whereas a building built on a pier and beam foundation has some ability for water to flow underneath and also has the ability to be elevated over time, perhaps as these scenarios and thresholds change. And I think if there's one thing for certain about the low country landscape is that it's dynamic and ever changing. So we need to plan, therefore, to adapt with it. So this map will give you a sense of the boundary of our study, which is a little bit different from other types of planning in Charleston and other boundaries you might be familiar with. You see here in dark gray, the Charleston city limits. So that's the extent of the city plan jurisdiction. Okay. Then you'll see the black dashed line. This line kind of circling around is the urban growth boundary. Again, city political boundary. But what we're looking at is this purple boundary. And these are, this is an outline of all of the urban watersheds that affect City of Charleston property. So we've looked across the region, really beginning with topography, with creeks and all of these subwatersheds, and found the area that impact, the water area impact on city property. That means, of course, water doesn't follow political boundaries. So property outside the city might be impacting property inside the city if runoff is transferred or flowing between the two. So we've taken this wider view on water as it relates to the city. A lot of these subwatersheds and these smaller purple lines, subwatersheds, are defined by topography. You'll see here the brown is the high ground, relatively high ground, down to green in the low ground, in the marsh. Most of the city of Charleston is in this yellow-green range. So you'll see that's kind of a 10 to 20 foot above sea level range. There are areas of the city that are quite a bit higher. For example, you'll see this brown peninsula on the Cainhoy Peninsula, where some of the land is over 30 feet, even 40 or 50 feet above sea level. So you can imagine that type of land has particular challenges in terms of runoff affecting its neighbors, but also particular opportunities in terms of what can or should be allowed to be built there, and also what should be protected in those areas. You'll see another area of notable higher ground beyond Upper West Ashley. And some of these ridges, old barrier ridges in Johns Island, also have quite a bit of elevation. So all of these landform structures present certain challenges and opportunities, especially as we think about adaptation going forward, the things that are already built. So we've broken down this wider watershed boundary into sub areas within the city: Johns Island, Outer West Ashley, Inner West Ashley, James Island, Peninsula, Daniel Island, and Cainhoy. So those are kind of our units of study, which correspond broadly to the City of Charleston vulnerability analysis. This vulnerability analysis work underpins our work today. And so we're trying to align with its process and approach and recommendations as much as possible. But one thing you'll see in this map is the floodplain itself. That's the light blue shape. So that is the 100-year floodplain as defined by FEMA. That means that there are multiple types of flood risk within this light blue shape. It's a combination of a FEMA model, which includes flooding from rainfall, includes flooding from tide and high tidal events, and it also includes flooding from storm surge. It's using a little bit different storm surge model than that yellow map I showed before. I'll get into a little more detail about that going forward. But the point to realize is that this 100-year floodplain, the blue shape, doesn't mean the same thing everywhere. Sometimes the elevations within it are slightly different, and sometimes the water risks within it are slightly different. And I'll get into that in a bit more detail as well. So one final thing to notice on this map is this VE zone. That's the gray areas. They're sort of around the edges. You'll see them here at the outlet of James Island Creek, see them here up the Ashley, a little bit up the Wando. These VE zones are defined by FEMA as areas that may be subject to higher water velocity and waves due to storm surge. So these are areas kind of at the edges that would bear the brunt of a storm surge risk and would bear storm surge elevations in a different way from areas elsewhere. So those are places of special focus. Just going to go around and zoom into a little bit finer detail in all of those areas of focus around the city. This presentation is going to stay pretty high level. Won't zoom in too far just for the sake of time today, but our analysis will zoom in and capture kind of cause and effect at the watershed scale ultimately. That's where we're headed. But for the purpose of today, I'm staying somewhat broader. So here you see all of the subwatersheds defined in the purple lines. The UGB is here too in the black dash. It's a little light in this map, but you can see it tracking through here. But the thing that I'd like you to focus on here are these purple lines. These are the subwatersheds in the city and give you a sense of the scale of the subwatersheds and how they change across the city. So for example, this is the Church Creek watershed in West Ashley. It's quite large, so it has a significant flow length. I'll get into what that means, what the upstream and downstream conditions are and how they're different, why that's important. You'll see in some other parts of the city, like Inner West Ashley, around the edges, as you get around the rivers and the sea, the watersheds tend to get smaller. there are smaller areas that drain directly into the rivers, for example, with less of that upstream, downstream impact. So that's important for land use coming up. But moving around the rest of the city, here you see Johns Island. We'll just pause here for a minute. One of the larger watersheds from Johns Island, Burden Creek. Again, you see how the watersheds sort of conform to topography. If you're familiar at all with this area, you know that the old dune structures run parallel to the coast on Johns Island, and you see some of the watersheds reflecting that underlying geology. Also on James Island, I would note that the largest watershed on the island is James Island Creek here, primarily tidal, even in its higher reaches, even though it's so large. It's relatively low lying. Okay, moving up to Daniel Island and Cainhoy. So if you remember that brown portion of the elevation map, it's kind of this zone here, which is out of the floodplain. It's much higher. And you see this floodplain zone surrounding it, lower elevations. One thing to point out here is on Daniel Island, you see that much of the island is light blue. Much of the island is in that 100-year floodplain. And something interesting that we've heard from stakeholders around the city is that Daniel Island does not report the same level of flooding from rainfall as other parts of town. And what we've heard, and the working hypothesis, is that this area has a more functional, better maintained drainage system, despite its relatively low-lying elevation, that allows water to drain away more quickly, more efficient manner, despite the fact that it's so low-lying. And that's under the current sea levels. So that's something, again, to project forward as those river and sea levels change over time. Okay, so here, those light blue areas are now shown in green, and we've added the orange, which is the additional portion of the city at risk of storm surge, Category 3 storm surge. It's important to note here, this is the 100-year floodplain defined by FEMA. This is the Category 3 maximum storm surge defined by the NOAA slosh model. They're different modeling types. This Category 3 storm surge, the yellow, is really building up on top of the green. I think you'll see that a little more clearly in a second. But just take note that much of the city, a large portion of the city within the UGB, is subject to water risk, whether that be in the 100-year floodplain as defined by FEMA, or this additional risk on top of less frequent but high magnitude storm surge risk. So here is a little graphic, hopefully to help explain that concept of stacking up a little better. In green, you have the tidal range. In yellow, you have the storm surge risk stacking on top of that. And kind of an interacting as you move inland is the tidal flood and rainwater. The landscape of the low country is characterized by 3 basic types. Aaron will get into this a little bit more in a few minutes. The coastal edge condition, the salt marsh, the floodplain, low-lying floodplain, with some variety of elevation within it. It's not all at the same level. And then the upland condition, those remnant dune, geological sand dune structures in the landscape, the highest ground. What we see as a typical condition is that those high grounds, the upland condition, has relatively better soils for stormwater infiltration, for water infiltration. That's important because we can utilize that opportunity to reduce the amount of stormwater runoff flowing downhill, down creeks and through ditches and slopes overland that cause flooding to back up at lower elevations. Also important to note in this drawing is the interaction, that there's a zone of interaction between stormwater flooding and the tide. That's this kind of compound area. This is important to identify going forward because it may suggest certain different types of adaptation strategies for structures that are built in that area today. So big picture, just take note that stormwater flooding is moving down from the upland towards the coastal edge with different impacts and opportunities along the way. And then there's this combined flooding mixing zone, which we'll explain a little bit more coming up. So I'll just spend a minute on this graphic. This is the next few are pretty data heavy. So again, I would encourage you to download this presentation online following this event to study more closely. But what this drawing represents, what this chart represents, is the land within the floodplain, the 100-year floodplain per elevation, and then the land within that orange shape, the storm surge risk area by elevation. So what you can see is that not all of the green shape, and let me just go back to that, those green and orange shapes for a second on this map. What this indicates is that not all of the green shape and not all of the orange areas are at the same elevation. There's variety within them. So the floodplain, that green shape, begins in basically all land at below 10 feet. All of it, 100%, is in the floodplain. If you go towards the high end, you can see about 10% of the land in that green floodplain is at the 15 to 16 foot range. So there's a range of about 5 or 6 feet in elevation change within that floodplain. That's where you get the nature of that compound flood risk. Imagine as rain is moving down, this compound flooding arrow here, rain is coming down from above, the tide is coming up from below, and those have impacts that influence one another across this elevation range. Then you'll see on top of that, building on top of that, is the storm surge risk, which also affects different areas of the city at different elevations into different water depths. That's something that is building on top of more frequent tidal and rainfall risk, but can impact the city up to a much higher elevation. So now we'll map those elevation thresholds across an average in the city. This is an average of all the land elevations within the urban growth boundary. So we see a range of land all the way from sea level up to over 30 feet. A small percentage of land in the city within the UGB is above 30 feet. Most of the land is occurring in this kind of range up to about 18 feet. On this side of the graph, you see tidal flood thresholds. This is according to the Charleston Harbor gauge. The major tidal flooding threshold, which was hit a couple of times based on king tides over the last couple of days there, is 8 feet above mean lower low. These ranges are projected to increase, of course, as sea level rise increases. So what we're trying to do, one of the things we're trying to do through this analysis is identify these risk thresholds and then apply those to specific areas of the city and see what the impacts are and what adaptive strategies might be put in place there. We have not identified specifically what those risk levels are yet. So these arrows are not pointing to a specific number in terms of elevation, but that's where this analysis is going. So while this graph is capturing all of the land within the UGB, we will be breaking this analysis down into each of those focus areas, whether it be Johns Island, James Island, you get the picture, and understand how these levels change specific to those places. If we overlay now those floodplain percentages and storm surge percentages based on elevation, I think where you get a sense that this land below 10 feet, and there's a range here, of course, but this land below about 10 feet is subject to multiple different types of flood risk more often, a high percentage of that land at those elevations. The percentage of land subject to floodplain and storm surge risk diminishes as you get higher. So as we refine these thresholds and carry this analysis forward, we will start to understand which types of recommendations make sense at which thresholds. This is related to some of the preliminary analysis we did in Dutch Dialogues on Johns Island, if you're familiar with that report at all, where we outlined a couple of key thresholds across the island based on water risk and the type of developments that we felt would be most suited to those ranges. Kind of taking that methodology now and applying it across the rest of the city in a much more rigorous way. I mean, you remember Dutch Dialogues was a fast, high-level process, and now we're able to get a little more into the detailed information. So I know these are complex graphics, but here's the early stage of identifying those different types of land elevations per focus area. And you can see how they compare to one another based on total land area. So if you look at this Cainhoy curve, for example, it looks like it's there's more gray area here in Cainhoy than on the other focus areas. That means there's more land area at higher elevations in Cainhoy. Remember back to that brown portion of the elevation map. Other areas of the city have more similar ranges. Johns Island has a little bit more land at high ground than elsewhere in the city, or at a higher elevation. But you see the tidal levels, and then eventually trying to map this tidal risk combined with compound flood risk across all of the zones. So again, this is not a specific level recommended here. This is a zone and a range that's being refined per individual focus area as we proceed in our analysis. Okay, putting all that information back together in map form, what we're showing here is trying to map that compound flood zone. You see this medium blue color at its specific thresholds across the city. So this map is quite complex. This compound flooding color represents area specific levels. So that blue color in Cainhoy, for example, represents a slightly different elevation than it does on Johns Island, based on the local land elevation and the local tidal and water impacts. So this is kind of a first attempt to synthesize and see where that compound flood risk zone occurs in space and how it might be changing over time as we project through multiple scenarios. In this case, this is representing a 3-foot sea level rise scenario. So those elevation ranges will be changing over time, as they have changed over time for the history of the low country. Again, this is high level city region wide. Our analysis will be zooming in as we proceed, getting into a little finer scale. Okay, I'm going to take a sip of water and give everyone a visual break from all those numbers. And we'll transition now into thinking about the watershed scale. So we've been talking up to this point about the city scale and the scale of our focus areas, but we need to get to a little bit finer grain to understand how water from one part of the city is impacting its neighbors, that upstream downstream condition within each of the urban watersheds. So for example, in Church Creek, there's a tidal influence up to a certain point. There's an upstream condition beyond that, and those two interact. And that's what we'll get into explaining a little bit more over the next few slides here. One of the first impacts that we expect to see at the edge is marsh migration as sea levels rise. So the salt marsh will naturally rise and change in elevation according to sea levels over time, starting at the mouth, at the outlet. So that's what you see here at Church Creek. So we're trying to get an understanding of what this landscape will look like over time as we expect sea level to rise and as we expect this salt marsh condition to change where it's located in the city and in these watersheds. So first attempt at mapping where that marsh migration might occur, also where marsh loss will occur as sea level rise is expected to drown some areas of existing salt marsh. The water will just get too deep in those areas to sustain the marsh grass and that ecological community. So that's what you see in red. Wetlands in the darker red that we expect to be lost in a 3-foot sea level rise scenario. And light red wetland marsh areas at risk. In green, you see where those marshes may naturally tend to migrate. That's moving up these tidal creeks, and that depends on the land surface condition as you move inland. Depends on the slope, depends on soil qualities, and what's built there, whether there's a road in the way, for example. So this is just kind of a broad brush projection on where we might see those impacts shift. It's important to know where these things may be going, because salt marsh serves a really important function, not only as a storm surge buffer, but as a sink for rainfall, a place to store rainfall without causing flooding. You can use these natural ecosystem functions as opportunities. And so a further layer, and I know this is a bit hard to read, but a first stage analysis at what that migrating marsh might be expected to find in terms of current land uses as it moves into the tidal creeks. You'll notice I'll go back and forth one time here. So focus on the green, these light green shapes, like here, for example, kind of the Rantles Creek area. That portion of land is currently a woody wetland. So most of the areas the marsh is expected to migrate, at least in the near term, are currently naturalized conditions. That might be a benefit for this ecosystem to sustain itself. Okay, now I'm going to hand it over to Aaron Stevens at Circulus to go through this marsh migration and landscape impact in a little more detail.
Thanks, Andy. Again, my name is Aaron Stevens. I'm a landscape architect here in Charleston. And what we're trying to show with these graphics here, it's visualizing what Andy was just talking about at the landscape scale. And as he mentioned, as the sea levels rise and as saltwater moves inland and upland, we need to allow for some areas for our marsh to migrate as well. So, and let me step back a second, because he did, Andy mentioned the importance of the marsh in protecting the land from storm surge and the potential for stormwater holding, but there's also a great ecological benefit to the marsh because it's an estuary for so many animal species and the home of a lot of different birds, mammals, crustaceans, fish, and everything. And not to mention its value culturally and economically to our city. So in the areas where we've identified great potential for the marsh to migrate, we think it's really important to maintain as much as we can a naturalized condition because as you see in the center graphic, if we keep what we call a softer edge that's planted and vegetated as the marsh moves inland, it can move in. And yes, a lot of the plants will die because they can't handle the salinity, but you will still have a place for that marsh to migrate. Whereas if we do, a structural bulkhead to prevent, that marsh migration, eventually it will go extinct because it will have nowhere to go. It can't travel up the face of the wall. So again, just emphasizing the importance of keeping a soft edge where we expect the marsh to migrate. And then another component that we're showing here is that in addition to changing locations of our saltwater marshes, the sea level rise projections also have the potential to create freshwater wetlands from emerging. You see the dashed line that runs through the middle of the soil, that's the water table. And as the saltwater moves inland, the freshwater that's currently in the ground actually floats on top of the saltwater because it's less dense. And when you have conditions where you have a lower elevation with a higher groundwater table, eventually that groundwater can get pushed through where it'll surface as an emerging freshwater wetland. And so these are areas where there will be greater potential for flooding. And if we can keep them natural and or allow them to become wetlands, vegetated wetlands, then we can deal with a lot more water in a nature-based way. If you want to flip to the next slide, I think that's all. So what we've done here is looking at, these future hydrologic conditions that we're starting to be able to predict with the maps that we just looked at, looking at soil types, which Joshua will get into more detail about later, but basically how well specific soil types drain or don't drain, looking at flood risk, and then looking at elevation. We began to develop these landscape typologies. So if we are either preserving or preserving existing vegetation or promoting the revegetation, reforestation of these areas, it's really important that we choose the right plants that will be most durable in the face of these anticipated changes. So we've developed, images kind of showing the iconic landscapes that we're describing here with a list of recommended plants that will be most durable in these changing conditions. And so all of these also are native plants because they provide great ecosystem services and can support the habitat necessary to preserve, the natural elements within our city. And now I'll turn it back over to Andy. He'll talk more about the structural and housing typology implications for these various conditions. Thanks.
Thank you, Erin. And I think just building on, putting a point on one thing you said about landscape adaptation, we often think about how buildings in the built environment need to change for a resilient city, but equally important is the landscape adaptation. And especially as someone who doesn't live in Charleston, it's striking how beautiful the salt marsh and the natural landscape of Charleston is naturally. And so also important, I think, to recognize the beauty of that landscape and its just inherent value in that way. But buildings and the built environment also need to evolve as the low country landscape changes. There are certain types of constructions that are more flood adaptive than others. I think in many ways, this is really simple logic. Homes, for example, built on a pier and beam allow flood water to move underneath them and can be raised over time. Whereas homes built on slabs, whether they're on existing ground or they're built up on landfill, on fill dirt, are inherently more difficult to adapt. They're much harder to lift up and change over time. Same for commercial buildings. Those tend to be a bit more fixed, maybe a bit of a longer term investment, yet they can still be adapted, whether that's dry flood proofed, whether it's allowing a raised floor inside, new types of access, or whether they're reconstructed perhaps at a little bit higher elevation. The fill dirt is a really sensitive and important issue, especially in a low landscape. You'll see the slab on fill is in the non-adaptive category in residential. It's located here, potentially adaptive for commercial buildings, only if additional mitigation measures are taken to store extra flood water and mitigate the runoff surrounding that property. Whereas the unmodified slab on grade, of course, is subject to flooding. Basically, sandbagging is the opportunity there, and water, especially if it's tidal and salt water, has pretty detrimental impacts on buildings. So these recommendations start to play out in space and have different value in different parts of the city. They can provide kind of just a quick glimpse at different ways forward in terms of adapting, but also adapting existing structures, what kinds of changes might be needed, as well as building new structures for the future, not using the same types of methodology that have elevated risk up to the present moment. So part of the analysis has been to capture the land cover types across the city. You'll see the darker red is the higher density building. The lighter red is more of a suburban condition. Green being a natural kind of forest landscape. And then the blue being the wetland or marsh edges. These different land cover types are really important based on the amount of rainfall runoff you could expect for each one. Paved surface that's highly developed produces more runoff than a forest, for example. So we need to understand the land cover types, especially within each focus area of the city and within each sub-watershed. So this is a bit of a complicated graph, but what we're trying to do here, and this is an example for Johns Island, is to analyze the type and amount of development occurring per elevation range existing. And then we can project this forward as sea levels and other types of water conditions are changing to see what's at risk and where to avoid putting more development at risk or new development at risk, where to build safely, grow and build safely. So what you can take away from this drawing, first of all, on the left, here's the curve. If you remember that curve from Johns Island, the land surface per elevation. Here's the floodplain risk per elevation, percentage of land in the floodplain. And then here on the right side, you see the land cover per elevation, per foot of elevation. The main thing is this gray shape that indicates land outside the urban growth boundary. So there is, if you look in this 10 foot and above range, there's a lot of gray stuff out there, but it's outside the urban growth boundary, even though it's high ground, but potentially perhaps suitable for certain types of development. What you do find is a little bit of urban development, this red and pink, but you still see a lot of forest on Johns Island, that's the green, some agriculture, and then some floodplain finally. But you see it's a lot of primarily naturalized condition remaining even on that high ground. If we compare Inner West Ashley, this is just a flip to compare to, you'll see that it's a lot more developed. There's a lot more red and pink. And you'll see that that development occurs primarily in this mid elevation range. It's a little bit lower down than Johns Island. So I'll flip back and forth just to compare. Here's Johns Island. You see that curve includes some higher ground and more green. Here's West Ashley. Curve came down a little bit, less availability of naturally high ground and more developed. So what does that mean? What are the consequences of this development and type of development? To understand that, we have to understand the different types of watersheds and where that development is occurring within it. So we have identified, we've classified basically small and large watersheds across the city. The small watersheds are areas that flow directly into a major waterway, the rivers or the sea, the harbor, without much of an upstream condition. The large watersheds include this upstream condition, whether it's a low-lying watershed such as James Island Creek, it's mostly tidal, so even the upstream condition is tidal, or something like Church Creek, where you have this upstream condition that's not tidal, it's subject to different kinds of flood risk. This upstream condition becomes really important because that's how whatever your upstream neighbors are doing affects you as it comes downstream. So we need to understand that relationship more closely. Here's a graphic representation of where those larger watersheds occur. So just my points of reference here, Church Creek, considered a larger watershed. And then here's that James Island Creek example, also larger watershed. These are determined through our analysis based on the length of the creek channel, based on the distance stormwater has to flow from the farthest inland condition until it reaches the outlet. And so that's sort of an indication of how many steps that runoff has to go through before it finally drains, and how many people along the way it could potentially impact, people and properties. That type of analysis, that stream length analysis, basically correlates with overall watershed area and also with overall flow volume. Not exactly, but it's a pretty good correlation. Then here you see where those high ground conditions actually occur in those larger watersheds, the darker blue. So focus on those darker blue areas. That's where the choices that are made based on land use and land cover and development have the most impact for everyone else coming downstream. It may mean these areas should be protected in different ways, or certain aspects of them, whether that be tree cover or soil. It's a fundamental relationship between your neighbors within the watershed. And Joshua Robinson will get into that in a little bit more detail.
Thank you, Andy. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. So yeah, I'm Joshua Robinson. I'm a an engineer here in Charleston. And as Andy's been describing, because of these flooding risks from the ocean, tidal surge and storm surge risks, it's going to become a better idea to move into the higher ground. And these higher ground areas are shown here, as Andy described, in this darker blue color. But the question we've also been asking is, as we move further, deeper into the landscape onto this higher ground, how do we do so in a way that doesn't create new stormwater flooding problems? So as we move upward to try to avoid the tidal flooding problems, how do we be responsible neighbors to those living downstream, especially in these large watershed areas where there are some large developed areas downstream of these areas, and we don't want to create new stormwater flooding that'll travel downstream and create flooding problems we don't currently have. Because what we do upstream affects everything downstream, and it affects things that are in the immediate vicinity. So one thing I want to point out is that one of the benefits of our landscape here is that these high areas also correspond to some of the most favorable soils in the area. So what you see here is a soils map of the soils broken into 4 different categories. These categories are called hydrologic soil groups, and they're just ways of thinking about how each soil type absorbs or infiltrates rainfall. So really this gets to the fundamental question about stormwater flooding, which is how much rainfall becomes runoff. And so as we do flood studies and think about how much of this rainfall is converted into stormwater runoff, the 2 main factors are land cover and soils. And so it's pretty obvious that a parking lot will shed more water than a forest will, or a rooftop will shed more water than a grassed area. But what we don't often think about is what do the soils themselves do? How do they absorb water? So the soils you see here shown in green, which are in hydrologic group A and hydrologic group B, these are the classes of soils. You can think of them as sandy soils that have a very high infiltration rate, or they can absorb a lot of stormwater. Whereas the soils in the yellow and the brown shades that are group C and group D, these are the soils that you can think of to be more like clays that can't absorb so much water, and they create more runoff. In other words, those clay soils function more like pavement because they shed a lot more of their water. And so this helps us to think about, in terms of land cover and soils, how can the land itself serve as a stormwater management tool? I mean, our primary stormwater management function, it is the soils and the trees, and how do we get more of the rainfall that falls on the landscape to soak into the soils so they can then be evaporated back up into the air by trees and vegetation. So that'll reduce the amount of runoff that moves in the downstream direction. So here's another way of looking at those soil groups. And I'd first like to draw your attention to this dashed line, that's the diagonal line that says 100% rainfall to runoff. And you can think of that line being like a parking lot, a paved area where for every inch of rain that falls, that entire inch of rain is going to be converted into direct runoff. And that means, in terms of an urban or suburban context, that runoff is water that we have to manage through stormwater conveyances such as pipes and ditches and channels. And that's water that ultimately makes its way into rivers and into the sea. Whereas if you look at the hydrologic soil groups, group A, again, that's the soil group, the green soils there that are on the highest areas. Those are the sandy soils. Those are the soils that are basically ancient sand dunes, ancient beach features that have a high infiltration rate. Something like a group A soil, if you have 6 inches of rainfall, only about 2 inches of that rainfall is converted into runoff. And where does the rest of the water go? Well, the rest of the water soaks into that soil to be part of the shallow groundwater, to then be used by the vegetation to evapotranspirated back up into the sky. So this helps us think about, again, how can we use the soils and the landscape, the vegetation, like Aaron mentioned, how can we use the actual natural landscape to manage more stormwater as we move up into these high ground areas, so as to not cause new flooding problems downstream.
Joshua, we had a question this morning about the phosphate areas. I wonder if you might just touch on that briefly. I'll go back to the map. Maybe how we think about those, or what the impacts, how that might change those things you just described.
Yeah, thank you, Andy. That's a great question. You know, one thing to point out is that nothing manages stormwater better than a wetland, because wetlands are shallow ponded areas that are filled with vegetation, and they hold stormwater during and immediately following a rain event, but then they also, let a lot of that water go back up into the sky through trees. Now, a lot of these wetland areas historically in our area were mined for phosphates, and so they're sort of open pit areas. They're just sort of open water. So one of the questions we got this morning was, should we fill those holes back in with better soil, perhaps? And that's a difficult question, but the open water areas are they're holding a lot of water. They have the potential to hold a lot of water and let some of that water evaporate back up into the sky. But the only better condition would be an actual wetland if it were to be converted back into a wetland. So then it's not just open water, but it actually has the trees and other vegetation to create the evapotranspiration. So in a lot of those areas where there's the phosphate mines, it tends to be in the low-lying areas that have the soil groups that don't infiltrate a lot of water. And that's why they were holding that water in the first place.
All right, thank you, Joshua. And we're happy to take in any more questions. Please use the chat as those questions come up. Okay, wrapping up here, just 2 more slides. Then we'll open it up and to questions. So one final map for you is the overlay of watersheds and politics. And this is a recurring theme that we heard in all of our conversations with people around the city, is that it's very difficult to understand sometimes. The political jurisdictions in Charleston are quite difficult to understand between properties that fall within a public service district, within the city, within the county, within an unincorporated area, within another town. So this map is starting to indicate those watersheds that are subject to only one jurisdiction, such as those brightest green areas subject only to City of Charleston jurisdiction, or those in orange and red that are subject to multiple overlapping jurisdictions. That means that multiple political entities control property outcomes within those watersheds. And this suggests areas where additional coordination and cooperation will be required to solve flooding issues. So for example, James Island Creek in this orange zone, multiple overlapping city town service districts that will be required to work together in order to solve problems. It's not enough to send water to your neighbor's property without knowing, without them understanding why or how or where it's going. So this is a tricky problem beyond the scope, the political jurisdictions and alignments and coordination. It's not part of our project right now, not part of our direct recommendations, but just trying to give some visibility into where that additional coordination will be required. Okay, just to reiterate, bringing back Jacob's slide from earlier on, there's a range of strategies that correspond to a range of possible future conditions in Charleston. Those land and water conditions vary in elevation, vary in surface type and cover. They vary based on what's already been built, what's proposed to be built, what's yet to be built. All of these factors occur in multiple scenarios and in different ranges. It's not a one-size-fits-all solution everywhere, but there are opportunities that come out of an analysis like this, whether that be based on ways to take advantage of favorable soil types or elevations, ways to anticipate future water changes at the edge, as compound flooding type, or upstream, and the relationship between them all. So ultimately, our project is a technical analysis. We will be giving this our results to the city. They will be incorporating that into the city plan, and then ultimately determining a suite of potential policy recommendations coming out of that. Those particular recommendations and their implementation is beyond us, but we hope that this analysis will ground those decisions in kind of the physical truth of land and water. So with that, we'll turn it over to questions. Looks like we've got maybe about 25 minutes left in our scheduled time. And Dale Morris has been closely watching the chat window, but maybe we'll save a few minutes at the end, Dale, for Chloe to wrap up with the next steps in the comp plan. But Dale, can you give us an update on the chat window?
Sure. Thank you, Andy. And thanks all the friends in Charleston for listening to this. A lot of information was thrown at you. My head hurt this morning after watching Andy go through this. And so if your head's hurting too, then we share that. Again, there's a lot of information here. The information will be available. This presentation will be available to you as a download from the city after this. And one thing to keep in mind is that the information that we will give to the city will have a fair amount of granularity to it. That we kept this at a high level, so it is digestible. But again, we understand that it is a lot of information to take in. So spend some time looking at it, and some of your questions or concerns may be answered. I tried to answer a few of the questions as they came in through the chat, but there are a few that I think our team, maybe even the city, would want to weigh in on. And one of the questions was clearly why we didn't list a number of key citizen stakeholders on the peninsula that we engaged with. So as I put in the chat, our team through the Dutch Dialogues, we understand in the effort through the Dutch Dialogues, we understand very well the various water challenges on the peninsula. Because of the study for the Dutch Dialogues, looking at the east side, looking at the entire peninsula, and looking at the medical district, we did have a shortcoming of information on Wagner Terrace and Rosemont and maybe parts of the neck, but some of that's North Charleston. So we spoke with people there, and over the course of last year, we have been speaking with a lot of people continually about the peninsula challenges. So we spent most of our time for this comp plan work looking at the other parts of the city that we didn't understand so well because we didn't look at it last year. So it wasn't that we ignored the peninsula, but we had a fair amount of information about it. So we felt confident there. Another question, fairly simple to answer, is, Andy, when you referred to James Island and James Island Creek being the primary watershed that we can see impacts from, and we have to ponder very closely, how do you manage those impacts? Was that the only thing we were looking at? And the answer is no, not at all. That is a watershed that we have to pay attention to, but we have looked at many parts of James Island, around the edge, Don Foley Road, in some of the very particular neighborhoods. I spoke with some citizens whose names are listed. We all did and picked up their information. So it wasn't that James Island Creek is our only focus. It just is a watershed that we really have to pay attention to. Then Mr. Ward asked a question, and perhaps the team can weigh in on this. The question was really about the pace of landscape change. Will the marshes, as Erin showed in her marsh migration strategy and in the drawing of where the marsh may want to migrate to and which marshes will be lost, with the rate of sea level rise and changing tidal conditions, will the marshes have time to move inland and establish themselves and to do all the wonderful things that they do? And of course, that depends on the rate of sea level rise, which is still unknown, but we can see more confidence in some of the trends. Also, as Andy noted, it depends on the nature of the edge of the marsh. Is it hardscape, or is it soft and amenable to allowing the marsh to migrate there? And it also relates to something called the sediment budget, which is, is there subsurface sediment where the marsh can attach itself and start to grow? And that will occur naturally as the grasses go. They trap sediment, and so that occurs naturally. But you have to understand water depth and the sediment balance in the areas that the marsh is going to grow into. But I don't know if Joshua or Aaron or anyone from our team want to answer that question further.
I think you covered a lot of the important points. I'd also say one other factor that is important to think about in predicting where it's likely to happen. It depends too on the slopes at the banks. Where you have a steeper slope, you're less likely to get the marsh because it needs that flat landscape to travel into. So again, I think there are a lot of factors that go into it. So there's not a simple answer, I'm sorry. But I think with by identifying the areas that are most likely to accommodate that migration and making sure that we keep those as natural as possible, we will allow for the most marsh migration to occur, considering, the changing dynamics of the coastline.
Okay, great. Thank you, Erin. Anyone else from the team?
Dale, I'd just like to jump in and acknowledge a question that I think I got, I saw privately from a man named Rick Dawson on the line. And Mr. Dawson, just like to acknowledge your response about migration and some of the changes there. I may just read this out. I think this is useful for others to understand. And some of your other questions too, Mr. Dawson. But marsh migration related to the salt line for jurisdictional purposes. He has been involved in mapping this line for SCDNR. He says the changes in wetland plant species will drastically affect coastal productivity. Have you calculated that impact to coastal fisheries and colonial bird communities? Have you considered the threat of invasive species establishing themselves if this environment changes too fast or can't reestablish itself after a catastrophic storm? Those are fundamental questions.
Great.
I don't know if anyone else would like to respond.
I'll add to that, Andy, that this is outside of the jurisdiction of the city, obviously, but we do expect new state rules in the next couple of years that would allow more living shorelines to go through the state regulatory process, which we expect to give, homeowners, landowners that are along the salt marsh edge is going to provide an alternative to bulkheads and riprap banks when there is erosion or when there's property loss. So just having that ability to build a living shoreline using the techniques that Erin shared a little while ago, that is going to be a great tool for those who do own property along the marsh in the city to create those conditions for the migration over longer periods of time, instead of just having the bulkhead, which just perpetuates erosion and causes more cycles of erosion and failure instead of allowing it to soften the edge and reduce flooding over time.
Great. And as the citizens of Charleston know, there are many really smart people, academics and professors over at the College of Charleston and at the Citadel who have a lot of knowledge about this. And they have been consulting with us. We have stayed in touch with them since the Dutch dialogues. And I think the city has a great opportunity to consult with them when they take our analysis and try to turn this into recommendations for the Planning Commission and possible recommendations for the future zoning code changes. So this is a work in progress, but it is it's a very important topic. And I think if you see some of the maps, you'll get a sense where it's very clear that some land is going to have to be reserved going forward so that the marshes can migrate to do all the wonderful things that they do. I'll move on to another question, and this is from Mr. John Zogler, and he is referring to the building typology slide, Andy, and maybe you want to put that up. He says, how do we encourage, commercial structures to be post and beam, and how do we encourage them to put parking on the ground floor and whatever, elevate above it so you can have resiliency from water events and minimize impervious surfaces. So this is an urban design and an architecture question as well as a land use question.
Yeah, this is David. I think it's a great question. We seem to have forgotten what the commercial structures in the past looked like along rivers and so forth. The elevated stores with the raised porches, and those stores were all raised, and we went up steps to them. The challenge becomes more and more the ability to provide universal access. So we can't just have the steps up to a store or commercial. We have to have some kind of platform we establish. The more you aggregate those, the easier it is to provide access at either end and raise the structure up to 2 or 3 feet that might be valuable in that case. The question asked about parking underneath is an abrupt question in an existing neighborhood. It often looks out of place or peculiar to the condition. If it's planned into a development, it can be done, parking underneath. works fine, you flood the car and you're safe. You still have to get the access for the individual up. But I really appreciate the question about why aren't we building commercial structures also in an elevated way on a pier and beam. We've been looking at this for years, and how do you just get the access more universally up to more buildings and not just a single store without having to do lifts and all that. But still the right question, the right way of thinking. Why not raise things a bit out of the floodplain and then get us and let us come up to them instead of rolling in or driving in as we've gotten used to doing.
Great. Anyone else from the team? Okay, great. I'll move on to another question. This is a difficult one, but it's one that's been looming. It's looming not only in the coast of South Carolina, but it's looming in most coastal areas in the U.S. It's clearly looming and happening in some other places. It's regarding retreat, and it was just a question. Why isn't retreat, or why isn't retreat one of the planning strategies that were identified? And I think we wanted to get through our analysis, and again, we're still not done with that, to get a sense of what that would mean and what that might look like, and we will pass those recommendations on to the city. But we will say that there are a lot of other places that are similarly situated to Charleston, where they have started to devise a retreat strategy, and these are in their very early stages. But in southeastern Virginia, there are a couple communities there that have identified it, Norfolk being one, but some of the surrounding communities. It's occurring in Louisiana. As you know, there the marshes have been substantially degraded for a lot of reasons, some man-made, some natural, but there are a lot of wonderful communities in the marshes, in Acadiana, and it's very tricky to decide what to do with that. But Louisiana is struggling with this. Parts of Texas are struggling with this. There's parts of New Jersey that are struggling with this. There are communities along the rivers, sort of on the upper stem of the Mississippi River in Iowa and in whatever further north of that are struggling. They have moved communities because of flood conditions. And clearly in the Netherlands, as you heard last year, and in the UK, they're also studying these issues and how do you retreat wisely and fairly. And I don't think there's an easy answer to that question, but it is something that if you look at the maps when we're done with them, that could be a conclusion. Again, and that would be not for us to suggest, it's for the city and the citizens to start to ponder. So I'll leave it at that. I don't know if David or Andy or Josh or Aaron want to say.
I think the broad retreat thing, like it's an army withdrawing from a field or something, is maybe one scale, but there's also the more surgical aspect of, in certain places you have one or two properties where the water goes, they are the places that flood. We've heard that discussion from our interviews with Charlestonians, that there's this corner over there that's low and that house floods all the time. I think that's another scale of action that could be taken. It's not broadly retreat, it's a really neighborhood relocations in some cases like that. So I think other tools in there, and I think if we use this term retreat, it sounds like an army, doesn't it? I think maybe we miss the opportunities that are local, and we can work with water a lot easier if we look more surgically at some of these conditions.
Right, and that's a wonderful point, David. And it's important to remind folks that in Charleston, there, with the buyouts in Shadow Moss and other buyouts that have occurred on an ad hoc basis, I mean, that is in essence a retreat strategy, this tactical one that David mentioned. And so this doesn't have to be, as David mentioned, abrupt or a massive movement of people, but it, can occur over time. And depending on how the city adapts to rising waters, maybe retreat is not retreat in the scale that we've suggested is not necessary. Again, we'll get to that. I'm going to move on to another question, and I have to read it here. So there's a question about have we been looking at polluted areas? I imagine that's polluted soil areas, or perhaps landfill areas that need special consideration. And I think we understand very clearly from the Dutch dialogues last year where the landfill and polluted soils are on the peninsula, but I'll pass it on to Andy. I don't think we've looked at the polluted soils or landfill areas in the other parts of the city.
We have not yet. That's a great point. I think we'll need to do a little bit more research about that.
Right. Okay, I'm looking at further questions that have come in. Mr. Cleland here asks about whether our group or others were interacting with the other folks on the flooding on the Charleston Peninsula regarding the Army Corps of Engineers study. And I'll pass it on to David if he's there.
Sorry. What, the 3? Yeah. Are we working on the 3x3? We hope we are considering. We're hopefully going to have an agreement with the city that lets us advise. Our intention is not to take an independent position, but a position in support of the city. So I think that we hope to provide counsel. It's a subtle condition. Obviously, it's quite involved, but in the period between now, October and December, we hope to provide that counsel to the city, working with the design department directly.
I think just to build on that point, we are not considering directly the 3x3 within the study of within the comp plan analysis. This is a broader, really regional, trying to capture regional approach to land and water. So that's even a little bit finer scale than I think we'll get to for the purpose of this analysis. Maybe a separate engagement to deal with those issues at a finer scale. Our purpose now is really to define the fundamental data and analytical tools that the city can use to make land use and policy decisions broadly going forward.
Great, thank you. So we're at 7:25, and I think Chloe in the city wanted a few minutes to wrap up. So I want to thank everyone for these great questions. Whatever they make us think. You saw a lot of information in these slides. As I mentioned at the outset, the city will get this information and digest it, and we're hopeful that the city will take the wisdom and the knowledge that we've given them and make wise decisions about future land use for the land use and water impacts for the city going forward. And I think to the citizens of Charleston, it's going to be up to you to work with the city leaders and the planning commission to help design, create the city that you want going forward. So our work is just to support that, to give you foundational information. But these land use decisions are what we call political decisions. And the decision on that has to go through those processes. And so we wish you, the best with that. Our team appreciates the challenges in Charleston that are there. We understand these are not easy things. They're not easy anywhere. But we also appreciate the struggle that you're going through. It's difficult, but we also respect very clearly, we respect very clearly the knowledge that's already within the city of Charleston, in its citizens, and its stakeholders, and within government to try to manage this successfully going forward. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. This is Chloe Stuber. I'm with the City of Charleston, the Planning Department. I'm working really closely with our engagement team at gathering public input throughout this planning process. So I want to appreciate everyone who has attended tonight, and especially those who've attended both morning and evening sessions. This is a lot of information. We're really excited to be able to be transparent about the analysis that is going on behind the scenes. And we understand it's a lot of information. So we will, this meeting is being streamed to YouTube and will be on the City Plan YouTube playlist for you to watch as many times over as you can stand. And also we'll have the slides from tonight that we'll share out with everyone in a follow-up email afterwards, so you can look over those more closely. And also down the road, when we have the final analysis, we'll be working on creating some educational materials that are little bit more boiled down that highlight the main takeaways from this. So more to come. We're in the beginning stages of this planning process, and so there will be many more opportunities to get involved. Can you go back one more slide? Go back, Andy. I want to highlight the survey is going to be open until November 1st. I encourage everyone to please take the survey. It only takes 10 minutes. Jim has dropped that link in the chat. And then also, if you want to make sure that you're staying in the loop about upcoming opportunities to get involved, please subscribe to the City Plan newsletter. Promise we won't flood your inbox. We'll only share when there is news to share. Okay, next slide, Andy. And for the upcoming meeting, so bottom left-hand corner is where we are today. So Water Labs. Tomorrow we have listening sessions with Johns Island. Friday we have a morning housing lab. Next week we have James Island listening sessions, and then an evening time for the housing lab. And then finally, to wrap up this first stage of engagement, we're having a meeting that will be primarily in Spanish, and that will be October 5th in the evening. So we hope you all will come to one of those upcoming meetings and will continue to stay involved as the process moves forward. Oh, and if you need to contact our team, cityplan@charleston-sc.gov is the email. You can email us questions, comments, ideas, whatever is on your mind. That's the email. Then also a good phone number to reach us by if you prefer phone is 843-834-5268. Thanks.
Thank you everyone for listening today, and we appreciate your feedback continuing going forward, and appreciate this opportunity to work with you all in the city. Have a good evening.